Hey everybody, it's Pete A. Turner, executive producer and host of the Break It Down Show. Waiting on Will to pop in. He's en route. I thought I would jump in and just say hey to everybody who doesn't normally check out the show. My name is Pete. I've been doing this for a long time, coming up on 10 years, if you can believe that. 10 years of the Break It Down Show, over 1,500 episodes. I kind of don't count anymore because it's just, hey, it's just a lot of episodes. And so thanks for coming and checking this out. We'll be here shortly. I'm looking here for a text and see. Okay, yeah. So same thing. He's on the way. So today we're going to talk about middlemen and getting that Sowellian middleman model and applying it to Ukraine. There's a crazy thing. So I've done a lot of work in conflict zones, a lot, and so I can speak in many ways. I can speak as an expert. I'm a peer-reviewed author in this case. I've done a lot of work on the ground. And actually, here's a note on the ground truth. And this is interesting because if you don't understand why the ground truth matters, your policy will be irrelevant. So if you go to the outskirts of the Baghdad province, there's a place called Tuatha. It was a nuclear plant. And if you know history, it's okay if you don't know this because you're not supposed to know this. If you know history, you know that the Israelis targeted Tuatha for a military strike and they took it out. No longer operates. If you go to the neighborhood around Tuatha or anywhere really in Baghdad and you say, what happened to the Tuatha nuclear plant? They'll say, yes, the Iranians attacked it. You'll wait, what? No, that was the Israelis. And I'm like, no, that's the commonly held belief, but it was really the Iranians. Okay, so now you have these two different realities. Well, you can reject their reality, but it is their reality. And when your policy can't comprehend these types of things, it's tough to make your policy work. Why is that important? Why is the human opinion on the ground important? Because that's their reality, right? And so when you think like, oh, it's hyper dangerous there and people walk around terrified and they don't, and you show up like ready for a gunfight every single day, and that's not how they live their lives. It's not reality. And so you have to like make your world similar to their world as much as possible. And you need someone who's good at the ground truth to help balance the scale so that you can get there. So when we say things like rule of law, well, rule of law is rule of law wherever it is. And it may not match your rule of law, but if that scale is out of whack, right? You have to try to figure out what exists on the ground and what do you want to exist? And if these things are too far apart, there's tension. And that tension, you have to resolve it in 3 dimensions. And it's not easy to do. It's not easy to do at all. So economic, political, all these different tensions are there all fighting in real time. And one of the rules of conflict zones is that the U.S. creates instability. I'm going to bug Will right now with the text. Hey, man, come on, right? Hey, man, come on. All right, come on. Aha, there he goes. Look at that. Just thinking about Will. Made Will. Anyhow, hey man, what's going on? I was filling some time. I was vamping, and I was talking about my own work on the time on the ground. I was talking about the different tensions between ground truth and the policy truth, right? Like as a political scientist, you're required to be a bit of a jack of all trades in a variety of subjects. You know, you need to have a little bit of capacity with economic theory and all these different theories. But one of the things my buddy Rich and I worked on was the ground truth. And if your policy, like when people say rule of law, right? There is rule of law on the ground. You just have to understand what it is. And if it doesn't line up with what you want rule of law to be, you have to make these things work together. And if your rule of law is so distant from what exists on the ground, there's a lot of energy to make these things line up, if it's even possible to make that work, right? Yeah. And that kind of goes to this greater point of middlemen. And in this case, I would be a middleman. I'm a ground truth guy. I'm going to go on the ground and say, hey, look, this is how they deal with murder in this village. And you're like, they deal with murder with no court, right? You need to have this person say, hey, listen, yeah, they deal with murder out there. And this is how they do it. Because if you can't, they can't, this is bullshit. Can't stop this show. Anyhow, if you deal with murder on the ground and they deal in civil court, that there's quite a distance between what we would call a criminal court and dealing with murder and civil court. So the middleman thing it's a real thing. And so when you take a collapsed economy, a command economy like the Soviet Union has, and you go to something other than that, you have to have these brokers who are entrepreneurial and say, hey, there's all of these bits of this economy that were working and now aren't. There's surplus here, there's a need over there, and it's cross country, right? Like, so you got to go to Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, all these different places to satisfy needs because people aren't getting fed, they aren't being clothed, they aren't being housed, all of these different areas. So I guess let's talk about, in terms of Ukraine, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and in the past, 30 plus years, and what that looks like for middlemen.
Well, I mean, that's a really broad question. I'm not necessarily a Ukraine. What you saw in the Soviet Union was a policy of state formation that failed. So, I mean, the old USSR obviously is, as you said, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And we think of that as Russia because Russia was the main enemy there. The culture was Slavic, which in a lot of ways is Russian, and so on. But there were actually, I think, 22 countries in the USSR at its peak. Like all the stands, Kyrgyzstan and all that were in the USSR. Ukraine was kind of the wheat-growing heartland of the USSR. And you had a lot of countries formed like that around that time. I mean, we were talking about after World War I, after World War II, the Ottomans. What's bullshit, Will?
Well, because Will had said this is bullshit. Can't stop this show. I don't know what would bullshit. You can't just say what bullshit.
I don't know because my name's Will. It's like what? I don't know. This is pretty controversial. This Russia stuff. Like Russia was in the USSR.
Yeah.
But
anyway,
that's
just me responding.
What you saw was an attempt to kind of ethnogenesis wouldn't be the term. That's the creation of a people. That's what we have in the USA. But kind of an attempt at national genesis that didn't work. People tried to take all of what Russians sometimes call the black asses, the people in the steppes. They tried to take all the other Slavs, so on down the line, and make them Soviets. And you saw a smaller scale version of this in Tito's Yugoslavia, for example, which is really, that's ripped from the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. And you had Moldavans, Serbians, Bosnians, Croats, and all that. They were just linked together as, I think Yugoslavian literally means South Slav. Like the national anthem of the country, Heja Slavinji means like, hey, Slavic people. And that shit kind of didn't work. Like people didn't really ever form an identity as Soviets or as Yugoslavs. So as soon as that central authority, like as soon as the Kremlin, the reach of that was limited to Russia, or as soon as the Yugoslav leaders died, you saw the collapse of that giant nation into 20 little fragments. And that actually, I don't think a lot of people understand this, although you did as a military man, but that's what really led to the Balkan War, for example, that we were involved in the 1990s. It was these ancient tribal hostilities surfacing as the pseudo-modern nation state collapsed. What did that do for middlemen? I mean, well, nothing good. There were middlemen groups in a lot of these countries. I mean, so for example, you had Albanians in what was going to become Serbia, that kind of thing. And what you saw to a large extent was harassment and ethnic purging of these people. So that's that last line, but this is kind of a pattern you see throughout history. Like when people say that diversity is something new in nation states, I mean, that's just not true. I mean, you go back to the Roman Empire, so on. But what you've seen over the years is empires or even large republics like consolidating huge areas of land. Like Rome at its peak stretched from Spain up into Gaul, which is northern France, over to Turkey. They controlled the whole of the Turkish peninsula, if I recall correctly. And when that collapsed, you saw kind of accelerating, shattering into smaller and smaller places. So, I mean, after the Romans fell, I mean, many of those regions, if you look at the bottom of the Italian boot, went down to the city-state level. So that's kind of a cyclical process throughout human history. Like a good leader consolidates territory. Like the old line, hard times create good men, soft times create bad ones. The empire weakens, empire falls, empire shatters into small city-states. Someone begins to build from one of the small city-states. Will that happen to the USA? The land under the eagle, which goes from California and Alaska to Maine? Probably at some point. Like to think about it. But what does Texas have in common with Vermont? All that.
Yeah. So when you look at, I'm going to scope back out now. When you look at competing disciplines, the 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 policymakers, the economists, all these different folks, when we look at something like Ukraine and we're trying to look, you get past the fighting and put these things up. These folks often compete, and the policy people, the State Department people, they really don't care if investment works or not. They just want to dump money in there and figure it out. But like the guys over at BlackRock, they're like, hey, we want this, we want these investments to work. And so when you look at things like the court, and there's if you look in the European news, you got to be careful when you look around there. You see problems. You see cases exiting the court system and going into the various European secondary courts, higher courts, saying, "Hey, man, I didn't get a fair case." And here's where the problem comes in. Like, okay, that can just be competition between in the case of an appeal outside of I can't get a fair case in the Ukrainian court. But when they win in a respected external court, and then it goes back to Ukraine, and Ukraine's like, get fucked. We don't care what the Swedish arbitration court. You're like, oh boy, that's a problem, right? That's okay if it happens once, but if it's happening again and again and again throughout a variety of external European courts, that's not only bad for a tell for Ukrainian corruption, that's also bad for business, because now you've got all these liens on properties. And, when you're a business person looking at that, I don't care what your policy is at state, it's going to be really hard to get people to want to go in and buy things if there's this judgment hanging overhead that's unresolved.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different things there. So Ukraine, to some extent, and yeah, Aaron's correct. The fact that Yugoslavia lasted into the 1990s is down to Tito's abilities as a leader, as the place was ready to collapse in the 30s. Yeah,
one of the most important leaders. Yeah.
Yeah. We often forget about Tito when we're ranking either the great good leaders or the great bad men of recent history. Unfortunate omission. But yeah, Yugoslavia was an artificial country. I mean, we've already talked about the components. But getting back to your point about Ukraine, Ukraine's a microcosm of larger situations in the developing world and in the former Second World in Eastern Europe. So, I mean, like, Ukraine itself is a legendarily corrupt country. And that was until we started, dick riding Ukraine recently. And I understand why, given the war with the Ruskies, but it was just understood that Ukraine had a Nazi problem. I mean, the Azov Battalion is a Nazi-inspired white nationalist fighting unit. They fight well. I mean, it doesn't have anything to do with their qualities on the battlefield, but that was just acknowledged. You can set your filters from 2012 to 2016, Google Azov Battalion Nazis. You'll see dozens of results, including stuff from the Times, the Post, the Tribune in Chicago. Ukraine was regularly recognized as one of the most crooked countries in the world. I mean, where officials regularly took bribes. Even Zelensky, like the currently legendary leader of Ukraine, is a comedian known apparently for sniffing coke. He had a bunch of personal issues. So, I mean, Ukraine is not necessarily the best place to do business. We're just in a partnership right now, at least so we think, that requires us to speak of Ukraine in these kind of positive terms. But I think that there's a broader issue, and you've probably seen a lot of this in the Middle East, so I'm interested in your kind of input. But there's an issue of kind of investment in the third world usually doesn't work. And I would say that this is a larger version of the reason for this is a larger version of the reason that investment in the ghetto usually doesn't work. Like, you have to be ready for institutions to some extent. Like, in order for popular elections to have any meaning, there has to be a desire among the people to be led by elected representatives rather than a strong king. There has to be a collapse of what you could call sub-governmental systems. So things that are almost as powerful as a nation right underneath it, like tribes and chiefdoms. So in a lot of Africa, like Kenya and so on, civilized enough, but like their democracy is really just a matter of seeing which tribe has had the most children recently. Like, everyone votes along tribal party lines. And again, everyone, there knows how to wear a business suit, civilized place. The Brits were there for a long time. The people themselves, pretty on point. So they're not going to descend into war, but it's just sort of like, that this party represents, what is it, the Kikuyu? Another party might represent the Maasai, the plateau inland region of the country. So you're not really having just democratic voting. How do you feel about abortion? You're just kind of counting heads along ethnic lines. And you could really do that without the pretense of a lot of the hyper-democratic institutions. So for things like an organized court system that recognizes equal women's rights or something like that to work, there has to be a pre-existing framework that would allow that to happen, if that makes sense. And
Yeah.
the same thing with business and all that. I mean, like, if you have one of the big problems in the third world is totally unromantic, it's totally boring, but it's the lack of a recent, well understood concept of real private property, like in our sense. So if you're trying to build in a particular region, of two countries that come to mind are Iraq and Guatemala, you'll find that there are all these quarreling claims to land from farmers, the sort of stuff you would have seen in England in 1400, as I understand. But like, whose land is this? You know, there are different claims to it. It's passed down through family lines. Some of it's passed down through village lines. There are traditional areas of land, at least in Latin America, which I know much better than the Middle East, which have been owned by whole communities. So if you're trying to build like a mall, it's going to be much more of an enterprise than it would be to build a mall in Scarsdale. So all of this comes into play. Like, if you give, I'm kind of rambling here, but basically if you give like any individual third world country $10 billion to build a dam, you're going to deal with structural problems. Like, much of that money is just going to be stolen by the leadership
Right.
class, by the forward clade in that country. Even if you do build the dam, is there infrastructure around the dam that makes it useful? Or are you just digging a fucking lake? Like, are there irrigation canals? Are there some sort of weird tribal conflicts that will prevent you from digging across like adjacent 20-mile stretches of land? So all of that has to be resolved before you can really do a lot of the things that, and this is when you're talking about last thing, but when you're talking about like top-down thought, this is, that bottom-up level has to be understood before you can make the top-down decision. If you say we're giving Zambia $20 billion for a dam, and you give them $20 billion and no dam ever gets constructed, you might almost move into some racial hereditarian stuff. Like, what is it with these people, these idiots? Can't they figure out how to dig holes? Well, no, that's not the issue. The issue is that the old chief took half the money. The issue is that the village refused to let you dig. The issue is that there are rebels in the bush, they would call it in Africa, in the wastelands outside the civilized area where you're building. And until you fix those bottom-up problems, you can't build the major construction project. And the reason I brought up the hood is it's the same thing. Like, you see enterprise zones all the time in the hood. Like, we're going to build this strip of businesses where no one even gets taxed. You know, we expect, you know, anything from Nashville fried chicken restaurants to black-owned art galleries to spring up. I just saw one of these plans at a big southern city. The problem is that there's so much crime in a lot of hood neighborhoods that it's just not possible. Like, no one wants to take their girl to an outdoor restaurant in quote-unquote Indian country where there are people sitting, no offense to actual Native American brothers, but where there are people sitting outside fucking shooting up heroin. I mean, you have to get rid of the junkies and pave the roads before you can build the boutiques.
Yeah, yeah. If you go one town away from the Edmund Pettus Bridge, there's not enough people and money there to run a gas station. I'm not fucking around. Like, that's true, right? And so you put a bunch of rehab money into either side of the Edmund Pettus Bridge to make like a tourist zone, you're going to have a lot of people coming in there to get some money because they don't have any, you know, and that's the same kind of thing you're talking about. The thing you're talking about earlier too, there is a difference between state building and nation building, right? And so if there isn't a state, it's up to the people to take care of what needs to be taken care of. And again, this goes back to this middleman thing. You know, if the state can't provide food, if they can't ensure that the businessman can have a place to sell his raw cotton or his ammonia and turn it into fertilizer, if they can't provide that, someone else has to do it. And that's where these middlemen come in, whether they're lending money, providing security, or, you know, they're filling these gaps. I think that's where it's applicable not only in the Middle East, but also especially in Ukraine. One of the things that we suck at, Will, and this goes back to the Middle Eastern experience and the Afghan experience, is we'll pick our favorite person. They usually speak English, and we'll say this is the person for sure to run the ammonia plant and provide. I mean, look, fertilizer. I'm using that as an example because Ukraine has a lot of capacity for fertilizer and, you know, things like all these raw materials. Like, they can turn titanium into any number of products, raw products, and then, you know, now you want to make things white. Well, you need titanium. You want to make these other metal products. You got to have all these things can happen. And there are people that currently do that. But if we decide we don't like those people, or if we decide we like these people more, we'll push them to the front of the line, whether they have that capacity or not. And if they don't have that capacity and they're not already wealthy, they're going to be like, I don't have my yacht yet. So sure, I'm going to run this titanium plant, but first let me get that yacht with this first round of money. And the second round of money, I got to take care of my homeboys. And the third round of money, you know what? I'm leaving because running a titanium plant is hard, right? Meanwhile, the other dude who actually knows how to run the plants, like I have 50,000 people that I've employed with all of these plants. And if you just get out of my way, I can create stability in a minute. But policy and economics don't always line up. And so that's like when these middlemen are hyper important because you do have to know the ground truth.
Yeah. So again, there are two different things there. One is that middlemen minorities are absolutely essential in places that are not linked to kind of the modern commercial economy. And you see this even in the hood. Like I keep analogizing these to some extent. I mean, like Appalachia or slum areas play to some extent a third world role in the modern American economy. But like when you go into an Appalachian holler, you're not going to see a lot of Kroger stores. Like it's even leaving race outside of this. Like it's pretty dangerous. There aren't that many people. You know, why would you build a Whole Foods there? You're not going to build one of those in a trailer court. What you're going to see are people often of Asian or Jewish or Arabic descent that have set up these well-run, clean little stores where the food costs maybe 10% more, but where it's available. Because again, otherwise there wouldn't be any food. There'd just be gas stations and Dollar Generals and the other things that would make money in that type of a community. So with these middleman minorities, you see people doing a smaller scale version of a big, well-known business in these underserved areas. Something else you also see is a lot of hostility toward them because the attitude of the Black or Appalachian guy in that neighborhood might be kind of insulted. Like, why ain't there any Kroger stores here? You know, we like exotic cheeses as much as the next man. And I mean, most people don't understand the entire global supply chain, right? Like it takes grocery stores operate on 3% net profit margins. So you can't be robbed from more than once or twice a year and make a profit. You can't have shoplifting at above X rate and make a profit. Most people don't understand that. They just think, you know, I'm a decent, hardworking guy. I'm an iron worker or a farmer or whatever, and you don't serve my community. So the middleman who does is often accused, sometimes even of driving the bigger businesses away, but certainly of kind of exploiting the community. Like I notice you charge more for a sausage than they do at the big store down the street. You just came in here to take from us. The reality is that the middleman is accepting the higher level of risk in that area to come in and do his thing. That's why the middleman minority is successful. And if the middleman minority leaves, like when they burnt out the Korean grocery stores in the Bronx in the 2000s, you're not going to see Whole Foods set up shop in a burnt out building. You're going to see no food at all. You know, no foods. That's what's going to be the outcome that's actually going to happen. You know, the second point is, yeah, again, it's top down versus bottom up, right? Like I call this the Ahmed Chalabi problem. Like the few times I've done really high level consulting, there's a tendency on the part of leaders to interact with other leaders who actually, contrary to the white supremacy fake narrative in the USA, tend to be really diverse. So it's kind of like, well, I know quite a few Iraqi or North Korean expatriates, right? Or certainly in the case of China, like all I have to do is go down to the club downtown and there are people from China, the Arab world, so on. Why not take, you know, such and such an individual that gives speeches at the Manhattan Institute that talks about his ideas for the country and put him in charge of a sector of the country? And the reality is that the person who does that may be an interesting intellectual, may write some good white papers, but almost certainly has no connections on the ground in contemporary Iraq or Afghanistan because they live in Manhattan. You know, so very often you see someone like that come in with maybe 50 bodyguards that they recruited from some half-hard mercenary company or something, and a couple of State Department mid-level apparat chicks, and sort of say they're running the country and just be kind of laughed at for a couple months. And then, like you said, leave. That's, as I recall, that's exactly what happened with Chalabi. He was on the sort of a base in the green zone and said he was running huge chunks of Iraq and not much happened. The thing to do would be to actually start from the bottom up. I mean, to ask local leaders, tribal chiefs, you know, the best generals of the defeated enemy force, so on. Who do you respect? Who's a good leader in this country? Who are the top men, or in some cases women, in this region? And pick one of those guys and work things out with him so that you're not, quote unquote, dissing him. You're transferring actual power. And that person becomes, you know, what would the old terms be? the visor. I mean, something like that person becomes an
Yeah.
actual
Yeah.
leader that can take charge. But it's harder to do that. It requires genuine investment. It requires time on the ground. And maybe most importantly, it requires not thinking of the local people as easily manipulated wogs, which is a weakness of ours. I mean, if you think about like going back to the Bush administration, where there were these 25-year-old kids running like the Iraqi mint. Like they didn't know what the hell they were doing. It was kind of like
Right.
this is a chance for, little Jimmy Jr. to get some experience in a place that doesn't matter with people that don't matter. That's the ugly
Yeah.
subtext.
Yeah. Meanwhile, there's some Iraqi guy who's a PhD graduate of London School of Economics, who used to have that job, and he's now like pushing a broom on an American camp, going, "I swear to God, I can do that job,"
Yeah.
And that is not far from the truth. I mean, I met so many engineers and physicians that we were hiring to hose down dust, and you're just like, what are we doing here? One of the biggest billionaires and billionaires / oligarchs in Ukraine is a guy named Pinchuk, and if you type in his name into Bing or any kind of search, you can type in Jeff Koons. Jeff Koons, the artist who makes like the giant balloon animal sculptures. And so we love that guy because he's tied to the Western world. He supports the arts. And so he's one of those guys, good or bad, where he's okay by us, right? But if you're just a hard-ass businessman who just goes out and gets after it and has, I don't know, like anybody who's a billionaire, you've got 10,000, you've got 120,000, you got all these people working for you. You don't got time for all of that stuff. If you're out in the European world and you're no way interested in America, we don't like that person. And so that person will be vilified most of the time. And once you get under the thumb, like politically of that person, because you're not worried about gaining favor with America, it's really hard to get out from under that rock, right? And so we pick our ponies, and we don't like. We had this dude who was an Iraqi guy. He had a shiny suit. He was from Canada and he spoke English, right? And he ran this, I'm going to do quoting fingers, a co-op. And we love a co-op, right? That's one of our codes for things that are going to work that are really bullshit. And he would throw a party for us whenever the State Department wanted to show up. So they'd call him on the phone. Hey, Ahmad, we're going to come down and we're going to check out the co-op and see how it's doing. And he'd be like, oh, that's great. And he'd bring his pretty girls from Iraq down, and they'd have hijabs on, and they'd have tight pants, and they'd have this lovely lunch. And I worked this area. Now, the State Department people would just be imported for the day. It was like combat tourism. And I'd watch, and he would explain all the stuff that they were doing. But that guy was never there if they weren't there. And so they would call, make an appointment, very gracious. And then I would go down to that place all the time. Hey, can we stop by the co-op? Nobody there. Nobody there. I talked to the farmers. Nobody there, right? But we loved that dude, and we would bring him stacks of hundreds and hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars. But if you look around, it looks as if that thing was a thriving and is still a thriving success. And it was always bullshit, right? And so you have this, again, this state and this policy desire. And this goes back to Sowell's thing where scarcity, like his rule, like scarcity, there's never enough of anything. And for the policy people, they don't give a damn about that rule. Like, just keep dumping money in and it'll all work itself out. But this is how we are the corrupting force in these cases, right? And so these people, and I would call them middlemen. From our point of view, they are the foreign middlemen, like these Ukrainians, these Russians who are all interconnected because they all grew up in the Soviet era. We don't like the ones that don't know us, that don't care about us. And so we think that they're bad people. And sometimes they are. Like I think the richest Ukrainian guy was an absolute thug hood. Like, let's all have a murderous thug battle, for their region. And it's known that, like, oh, that guy's from that gang. He's from, like, literally like the Crips. And then the Crips won. And so it's like, I'm the King Crip. And whether or not that guy killed anybody doesn't really matter. He's from that set. And they're like, yeah, but now he's a billionaire and he's all right by us because he pays the right people.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this is kind of like the value of quote unquote networking. Obviously, the USA has more of an interest in people who are willing to do outreach with the USA, recognize American culture, so on down the line. And I mean, it's pretty well recognized in the developing world that that's a marketable skill. Like you want to get someone on your team who's half Caucasian or has a contact like Hunter Biden or something like this. Not even trying to make fun of it, but who can network with the Western world. The real question of whether those people are any more moral than people that exist in the society that don't have those quote unquote social graces is an interesting one. I mean, my obvious inclination would be to say no. They've just picked up this additional ability of maybe because of educational background or something like that to be able to do outreach with us and with our business people. So there's nothing wrong with that. But again, the goal, if you're in a place like Iraq, would be to have, first of all, I mean, this might sound like manna to your ears as someone who's actually walking around with a gun. But one thing you could do is actually listen to the troops, listen to the NCOs you had in the field, the people that have been there for a while, listen to the interpreters who went into battle with you guys, listen to village leaders. It might help if you could speak Arabic, if you're going to be an American in Iraq. So you could, again, pick who the best businessmen were in the area. Like, so it's kind of like, have you ever heard the old parable about the drunk looking for their car keys?
No, tell us.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just it's a one-line joke, but it's like there's a cop who walks down the street, old flat-foot cop. He's twirling, the hardwood donkey dick baton, and he sees a guy who's on his hands and knees scrabbling around under a street lamp. And he asks the guy, "What are you doing?" And the guy says, "Well, I'm looking for my car keys." And the cop says, "Well, sir, I noticed you're a little drunk. Why do you think your car keys would be under this street lamp? There's like a 2-mile stretch of road away from the bar strip." And the guy says, "This is the only place I can look because it's where the light is." And you recognize that it's a funny joke and maybe he'll find the keys, but obviously the odds are, 12 feet out of 2 miles that he will. It's the same thing when it comes to foreign interaction. Like if you're the typical American, I mean, that's another joke. Like, what do you call someone that speaks 2 languages? Bilingual. What do you call someone that speaks 3 languages? Trilingual. What do you call someone that speaks 1 language badly? American. I mean, if you're the typical Yank, like big guy, red tie on, you're there visiting the soldiers and acting like you've done something in the war. The only people you're going to be able to talk to are people that speak English and preferably share your class background. So you're going to select local leaders from among that group. And Aaron says, yeah, the American actions in Afghanistan and Iraq were old-fashioned colonial interventions carried out by people who were instinctively anti-colonialist. Yeah, that's actually true. I mean, so the American conquerors were a little awkward about recruiting the toughest, most bloodthirsty local allies. We're a little awkward about even speaking the language. There was a lot of reluctance just to say, okay, we won the war. You cost us $1 trillion. We're taking your fucking oil for 10 years. I would have had no problem with that, by the way. Like that, those are the wages of defeat. Like in Afghanistan, certainly they harbored terrorists that struck at the center of our business community. I mean, they don't have a lot of oil there either. But I mean, like, we didn't do those things, though. That's the point. So there was this weird attempt to frame what we were doing. Why were we there if not to take from the people we conquered after a reasonably honorable war? And you had all these justifications that were basically made up, like we're here to bring democracy to people that want it. I mean, Bush sounded like a parrot when he talked about this. And the reality was that they didn't want it. I mean, the majority of Iraqis, up until just before Gulf War II, had a fairly positive view of Hussein, who was seen as crazy, but a strong, fairly stable leader. The Iran-Iraq war was over. I mean, there weren't a lot of problems necessarily that existed. So, I mean, when we went in, getting to the point, we didn't pick a good leadership team. We didn't pick strong, quote unquote, native allies. We didn't even learn the local tongue. And we just started walking around with flags talking about democracy and Jesus. It got kind of predictable results and that nothing happened. The idea of these English-speaking Americans working with this local co-op that was only open when English-speaking Americans were there is a real metaphor for something.
Yeah.
Good, something.
So we don't have a good track record of state or nation building. We've been to places that are nutrient and resource rich and haven't done well. So I don't know, what do we do this time? We have this. Look, we believe we can do it, and we'll hear all like let me at him. Let me try again. And by the way, the people in charge have had a number of whacks at this pinata, and the candy's still inside. So let's understand that. But you're the political scientist. What do we do different this time? I mean, I really think that we do kind of just get out of their way and figure out how to let's let the business world sort of sort this out. And that's a little bit scary for folks that don't like big corporations, but these guys can produce fertilizer and titanium energy like crazy, right? They can feed all of Europe. Why don't we just get out of their way and let them do that?
Well, what we're doing in Ukraine, I think, is actually pretty well done. Like, I mean, as you know, I'm kind of on the right politically, but not in kind of a stupid contrarian, like Hitler was right sort of sense.
Yeah.
I mean, any more than when it comes to things I'm a bit left about, like healthcare, I swing toward communism. So, I mean, the reason I'm talking about this is that the Ukraine war has gotten an enormous backlash, mostly on the political right. The
Mhm.
idea is sort of it represents what we shouldn't be doing. We're giving money to these corrupt sort of Eastern semi-Europeans that they're stealing, why are we fighting Russia, a proud Christian country, which is an insane question. We've been fighting Russia for 60 years. It's kind of what we do as Americans. But I mean, there's a great deal of hostility toward the conflict. I actually think that the Ukraine war is a completely logical war. I mean, it's an obvious proxy war. What we're doing is that we, the Americans, the French, other major countries, decided to help Ukraine respond to what really was an unprovoked Ruski invasion. I mean, the
Yeah.
Russians came over the border with very little warning. The Ukrainians have been too, but they've certainly been committing rapes and atrocities. And just morally, that wouldn't prompt us to intervene. That happens in war, unfortunately. But when that's happening to a country that we were fairly friendly with at the hands of our old rival, there's really no reason on earth we wouldn't do what we're doing, which is commit a total package of maybe 80 billion in aid and let them buy javelins and so on. The USA has actually done a pretty good job of keeping out of ground operations in Ukraine. We haven't even sent the dreaded military advisors from Vietnam, if I recall correctly, at least not over the border. I mean, so what we're really doing is sending a solid second world military, javelins, other anti-tank materiel, missiles, the larger missiles. What is it? Anti-personnel mines. I have some issues with that one. But basically, we're just helping them fight. And all of Europe has agreed to pick up, more than a quarter of the tab for that. So I think that's pretty much just what we keep doing. The two things that
Yeah.
I would avoid doing in Ukraine, since, I mean, you asked a great version of that question, are one, getting involved in a way that's just inescapable, like sending in U.S. Marines that
Yeah.
Putin is going to have to send Wagner mercenaries now that the two sides over there are together again to counter. That, like a situation where they're actually American and Russian forces with those flags on their helmets shooting each other. I mean, that's not good. Even beyond, like, will it lead to World War III? It's going to make Security Council meetings real awkward when it comes to
Yeah.
resolving other global conflicts and so on. So don't do that. And I wouldn't take escalation. This is just kind of me bullshitting a little bit, but I wouldn't take escalation past a certain point. Like, we kept seeing these headlines like, should we send Ukraine nuclear capable F-15s? It's like, no.
No.
No. I mean, what we want to do is send them anti-tank stuff so they can fight the Russians for another year, and then we and the Chinese call both sides to the table. Let's not pretend this isn't what it is. I mean, we don't need to send them nuclear armed warplanes. We also don't need to stop arming them. 50 billion a year, frankly, sounds about right for a war. So I don't have the huge objections to the Ukraine war beyond a generalized objection to war. I've actually seen violence, although not at the level you have, and I dislike it. So I mean, I don't want to kill a lot of young Russian men for no reason. But to the extent that we haven't called for talks yet, the fighting's going on. I don't have a problem with us helping them out.
I guess I'm asking more about the post-war side. Like, it's kind of a foregone conclusion at some point, these guys were all going to have to sit down. And by the way, this is a big surprise to people, but Russia and Ukraine are going to continue to be neighbors, and they're all interconnected with pipelines and all this stuff, right? And we need to not have any kind of insurgency. We need this stuff to be stable. So what do we do differently? Like, look, what we don't need to do is teach Ukrainians how to farm, right? They know how to do that stuff. So how do we get out of our own way? What do we do differently than what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan? How do we let these guys thrive business wise?
Well, I think both you and I already said that. I mean, the thing that we do is not invade in a colonial manner, take over the country, not fight the Russians directly. I mean, in Iraq and Afghanistan, I once attracted, like, this is the only time I've ever been, like, protested from the right. But I mean, I once said as a speaker at a pretty big event, it might have been one of the Midwest political science panels, it might have just been a speech, but that I don't think 9/11 necessarily changed the world. I think 9/11 was a terrorist attack against the country launched by a master terrorist, and people working for him. It killed several thousand people. All of his men also died, and we then retaliated with strikes that killed several thousand people in the next couple of weeks. I wouldn't have left it at that. I would have tracked bin Laden to the end of the world and hung him. But I mean, like, beyond that, beyond your strikes kill as many as their strike and then you hang the leader, do you need to do anything? I'm not convinced you do. I'm not convinced that we needed to, you could argue Afghanistan, but that we needed to take over Iraq and run the place as a colonial fiefdom for 10 years. I mean, that seems like real Al Capone-ish, like you punch me and I'll stab you. And even if you think America should make that kind of gesture, it was the wrong country. I remember Colin Powell and Petraeus as a young light bird and all these other people like trotting out these slides like, he's got nukes. And I was like, no, he doesn't. You're showing like aluminum tubes for like the various other business purposes. And a lot of this within a month of that speech, the speech itself was quite good, had become fairly evident, if I recall the timelines correctly. So I don't necessarily think we needed to do that. My point is that in Ukraine, we should avoid anything like that like hell. Like if there is any proposal that an American armed base with nuclear capabilities be located just across the border with Russia to monitor Russian occupation of the Crimea, with that being a signal the Ukrainians might try to take that region back, I think we should say hard no to that. I mean, I would assume that peace talks would produce some kind of compromise result, like Ukraine will never be in NATO as long as Russia commits to the following security guarantees, aware that America will respond if they don't. I mean, what the exact terms might be remains to be seen, right? But that sort of thing is kind of the goal. What we should not do is remain permanently lodged in Ukraine or do anything like what we did in Iraq. That's the answer. And I don't think we're going to do that. So Ukraine also, like, I mean, the Eastern European countries are, kind of third world, but they're close to Europe. It's not a racial thing. I mean, they're certainly not a place I'd choose to live in terms of development, but they're close to Europe. They're tied into the pipelines. I don't think we need to give them a lot of advice on how to sell wheat. Like when the war is over, we need to go home and let them sell their own wheat.
Do you think we will?
Well, I mean, like there's an old line from Rome, like where the eagle's wings darken, where the eagle flies, it stays, or something like that. I mean, like we have that problem. And you understand when you listen to serious world leaders like Putin and Xi talk about us, they're not just saying like we hate democracy. It's like, well, the USA has armed bases in 76 countries, including 12 close to our own borders. So it's logical, for example, that we would want to fortify our position on the coastline facing Taiwan. Like there are real practical reasons that they would make the decisions they do. Mm-hmm. So, are we going to extend that in Ukraine? I hope not. A lot of those questions, like, will Ukraine join NATO? I mean, I don't think formal Ukrainian membership in NATO is a good idea because that puts NATO up against Russia's border. There's no buffer zone. This would certainly be the case if, well, Belarus is on Russia's side. But I mean, if multiple states surrounding Russia were in the NATO alliance, the odds of a nuclear war or a major war would just substantially increase. I think that the goal would be Ukraine doesn't join NATO in exchange for real security guarantees, some money from us, so on down the line.
Yeah.
Will we do that? Will we do the most logical thing? I don't know.
And we also have existing deals, right, with these guys saying, hey, yeah, we understand. We don't need to do. We've done that to Ukraine, Iran. We've surrounded those guys, and we've given them no off ramp, right? And so, yeah, I don't know that it's a good idea either. Do we want to spend $1 trillion in aid? Again, we're desperate to do this stuff. And this is what the people who are currently in charge love to do. They love to here's some money. And they don't have any accountability required with this money quite often. Let's be honest, Zelensky, and I'm not against Zelensky, but that guy's not gotten less wealthy since this war has started.
Yeah, no, Zelensky's worth something like $1 billion, as I recall. I'd have to check. Yeah. But no, he's not a poor man. He's not a non-corrupt man. To me, the whole foreign aid doesn't work especially well. And there are whole books about this, like The White Man's Burden, with that title obviously being sort of a dry joke, that look at why this is. But in short form, foreign aid is often just stolen by corrupt local leaders. Foreign aid often disrupts pre-existing systems so that you wind up with about the same amount of output. So, I mean, the classic is food aid. If you drop off food in a country, say in Africa, It depresses the price of local foodstuff, so it makes it non-productive for farmers to grow food. So in the end, you wind up with the same amount of, bagged, shucked corn. You've just driven some farmers off their land. By the way, when people say Africa imports 60% of its food and so on, this is the reason. I mean, the major African countries like Nigeria and South Africa are primitive by our standards, but could pretty easily grow all the rice they needed and then some. They don't bother to do that because they're often in these food supply contracts with the West that stretch for 10 more years. So what's the point of growing rice if every year you're shipped 1 million pounds of bleached rice in bags? Like, if you're a rice farmer, you make nothing and you can't eat just rice. So, I mean, that's another side effect of food aid, financial aid that no one thinks about. And a third point is just that much of the money is misused on projects. This is the first thing we started the conversation with, that don't make a lot of sense unless you have surrounding infrastructure. So the classic example is a dam that's built without aqueducts, without a network of irrigation canals, so on down the line. And all you do when you do that is just build a lake. I mean, really, in a lot of the rainy parts of Africa, you can just dig a big hole and you'd get a lake. I mean, there's really no reason to do these massive investments unless you have a framework for them. I mean, like the old colonial libraries in Africa are mostly just sitting there because most of the population no longer reads that language and the lights are only on half the day. So what kind of research are you going to do in the dark in a foreign language? So if you're gonna give funds to that, to like the major library in Cameroon, the old German and British Cameroons, you should first look at whether anyone uses it. Are there texts in the local language? Are the lights and the AC on? So those are the three problems. I mean, corruption, misallocation, where giving in one place shuts down an entire other industry, and then three, the uselessness of the project. So I don't think we're going to do a lot of that in Ukraine because Ukraine's more developed, but we should.
I mean, I think we'll try. I think we'll be desperate to give a whole bunch of money out. I think we'll come up with our own ideas on how to teach Ukrainian farmers how to farm better. Like, hey, you need robot tractors. And I promise someone's gonna pitch co-ops, because they love a co-op out there in the State Department. They just love that shit. If you guys had a bunch of robot tractors, you guys all borrowed, you'd produce so much food. I saw so much of that kind of thought in Iraq. I don't know how they would turn that off. And there's contract money in it, right? Like they would hey, if you sign up for this contract, U.S. Ag will have put out, these farmers will be able to go on their little safari to Ukraine and teach Ukrainian farmers how to grow beets or whatever it is. There's money to be made in doing that stuff. So I don't know. It's a little frustrating to think about, but it is what we love to do. The other thing I wanted to ask you about when it comes to all of this reconstruction and corruption, one of the things that I know about corruption is that we're the corrupting force, right? We bring a big old sack of money and we're coming no matter what, right? Like, I'm going to be here no matter what with $1 million. Either you can get it or your neighbor will. The person's like, well, fuck, I'll take the $1 million then, right? And that creates instability because now that guy's got $1 million. Well, I didn't get $1 million. How do I get $1 million? I'm going to go communicate with some bombs and some fists and some anger. And all of a sudden, the U.S.'s presence, this is Pete's law. The U.S.'s presence by default creates instability. We don't accept that. That's the second law, is that we'll reject that reality. But if you go look around, when we show up, we make things less stable. And so really, by not being there, they handle their own stuff better. It's, have a few small agents that go there with very little things to do, and you do better. Also, you have to have a third party to check out what the Americans are doing, because we're not to be trusted. We'll lie to ourselves and tell us, hey, that dam's working great. I was there yesterday. It's awesome. And then everybody like, yeah, the dam's awesome. But then Pete goes there and is like, yeah, that dam fucked up a bunch of things. Let me make you a list. And then nobody will care because they're like, no, but we heard the dam is awesome. So there's all these problems when we go and we do things. I guess that's just me kind of rambling from my own experience. The other thing is curious, but if Donald Trump wins the election, this all changes. All of it. It gets really crazy really fast.
Yeah, well, you said if Donald Trump wins the election?
Yeah.
Well, first, like a comment on the serious point. Not that wasn't serious, but I think Trump and Biden are both geriatric crooks. Like, whichever one wins the election is going to die in office. You
I
got a
hope
guy
so.
who's 81 running against a guy who's 80. And people are pretending these are both like the most virile guys.
Oh, yeah, so masculine. Yes.
Yeah, but I mean, that's the whole thing with both of them. It's like Dark Brandon versus like MAGA Daddy. And it's like these guys can barely walk. I guess I'd vote for Trump given only those two options, but like anyone else, like DeSantis and Newsom. I mean, who else is in this field? Tim Scott. Like, anyway, that's a
Anyway,
separate rant of mine. Like, why are these
yeah.
geriatric old geezers, still out in the lead of the field? But in terms of the bigger point there, I think that there's a lot for the modern West to learn from actual colonialism. So
Mm.
I've been reading some books that I would recommend right now by Bruce Gilley, who's a defender of European colonialism. And Gilley makes a really obvious point, which is like European colonialism looks brutal when we judge it and only it by the standards of today. But that's a completely irrational thing to do. Like the Europeans almost invariably beat native colonizers that were nearly as good in battle, like the Mughals in India, that are still legends today, like the Arabs. If you look at Lawrence of Arabia, the Malay sultans. I mean, the Barbary pirates, the people that gave us, what the Marine Corps hymn and one of the terms we use for pirate. So in that real context, Gilley's point is that like a more advanced society beating an equally bloody, less advanced society is generally a good thing because the technology of the more advanced society then flows into the less advanced society where there's no more brutality than there otherwise would have been. And this strikes me as just being logically true. But at any rate, I recommend Gilley. But a point he makes in his books about colonialism is that when done well, like by the British in Central Africa, for example, there's a very small colonial force, first of all. And the purpose of the colonizer is to teach the skills they already have to the people in the new territory, the newly conquered area or whatever. And even if you say this is totally amoral, like no one actually believed in like the white man's burden, they just wanted to more efficiently exploit, that would still require teaching those skills. So like this whole recent debate about did enslaved people in the USA learn any new skills? Like, yeah, slavery was horrible, obviously, but of course, yes. Like battle captive enslavement was universal around the world at that time. So all the slaves that were sold to the USA were black battle captives and their families that were taken by like the Ashanti or the Benin or someone in Africa. Had they
Right.
remained in Africa, they still would have been slaves. The slavery probably would have been slightly less harsh, but of course there would have been fewer skills learned. Like no one would have learned how to be a cowboy, train operator, modern boat builder. It's not a moral statement, it's just a factual statement. So
Right. Right.
anyway, even if you think this was done to exploit, actual colonialism involved not giving people things, but teaching them skills so that they could contribute later to the empire as a soldier or whatever the case might be. One, and it also involved people like the actual Rudyard Kipling style British colonial officials who went to their new countries and I'm sure thought of themselves as members of the ruling class, but thought of themselves almost as citizens of those places as well as England and learned the
Sure.
language, learned the local culture, so on. Like Kipling wrote all of these books, like the Jungle Book, just to pick the most widely distributed, kind of lowest IQ one, but about India, because he lived in India for whatever, 22 years. So if you actually want to do this, if you want to improve developing world countries, you have to learn, even to the level that like the British conquerors did. I mean, I think we can get past that mark, right? But you have to learn that society really, really well, and you have to live there, one. And two, you have to not just give people things, you have to teach people things. By the end
Yeah.
of the British Empire, the best soldiers in the world, I mean, I'm sure they were pretty rock solid before this, but were Gurkhas from Nepal. I mean, who fought for Britain. They're still among the best soldiers in the world. The former Zulus from South Africa were no slouches either. So, like, all these fighting men that had narrowly lost to the British became even better in British service.
Yeah.
And they now live
Yeah.
in countries, Nepal, South Africa, are countries today. So you can't just drop a bunch of wheat off at the dock and hope the king doesn't steal it. If you're going to do this stuff, which I'm not even sure I recommend, there's a system that works. But as the commenter said earlier, it's not what we're doing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and if you're anti-slavery, you should know the history of Charles Gordon. There's a guy that gave his life and worked for decades trying to end slavery in the 1800s. But we don't care about that. We want to study history in the way that it's all misery and horrible things, not like, hey, these are people that worked on ending that stuff. Last thought from you on we have a tendency to again dismiss these Ukrainian business people as oligarchs. Again, we got this guy Pinchuk who is tied to Jeff Koons, so he's aces. But if you do well out there, you're automatically an oligarch as a norm, and they'll say things like, "Somehow this person got rich," but we don't know. We don't know these guys' stories because we don't invest time into it, and they haven't really bothered to tell their stories. And so, one of the things I've noticed from digging into some of these things is there's a lot of mystery. And when they say they're an oligarch, I mean, is Bill Gates an oligarch? Is Jack from Twitter an oligarch? Is, and then you can say all these things. So I think that the oligarch thing is a lot of bullshit. And when you look in the news and you just see negative news things, they tend to recycle the same narrative. And when they could take a positive or negative spin, they tend to always throw the negative on there. And so it's like, you know what? There's more political machinations going on than there are actual data points being put forward. It's like these self-fulfilling things, as opposed to this person actually is an actual oligarch, as opposed to this is a someone who actually knows this industry and he's an industrialist, or he is a vital cog in the actual economies of Ukraine or Belarus or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think, oh yeah, Aaron has a comment here. As I once heard it described, the British ran the Sudan with 50 civil servants on bicycles and a few battalions of troops. Yeah, many of the troops were Sudanese as well.
Yeah.
There's actually a lot of really cool history about the period I call the Old Wars, when the great races and religions encountered and fought each other. I mean, like, one element is the Askari, the colonials, the British and the Germans encountered these legendary fighting races, would be their term, but groups of warriors like the Zulus, the Herero. That didn't work out too well for them. Mass charges against the German machine guns and all that. But I mean, more cheerfully, the Nepalese, so on down the line. And there were these entire battalions of locally recruited fighters known as Askaris in Africa, who are still considered some of the best human fighters to have existed, at least for that climate. So most of the people that were in Sudan following the British defeat of the Mahdi's weren't Brits. They were just educated Sudanese. I mean, that country has kind of gone to hell lately. Communism had that effect on a lot of the former colonial possessions in the 70s. But I mean, there's a long Muslim tradition of learning in Sudan and Mali, interestingly enough. Mali is where Mansa Musa is from. So if you're actually interested in history, as versus just flagellating yourself as a white guy, I mean, there's fascinating stuff that can make pretty much everyone proud of, quote unquote, their ancestors. I encourage people to go out and read some books. But could you repeat the question again? Actually, I got off on a side.
It was the whole thing about the oligarchs.
Okay. Yeah. Oligarchs. I think that's an example of what you call a frame or a heuristic. There are ways that we look at this big, complicated world and try to simplify it. And one of ours is that successful businessmen in Eastern Europe, Southern Asia, and the stable portions of Africa are oligarchs. And what that means essentially is ass kicker who has a lot of money, maybe Mexico too. I mean, maybe we think of them as more cartelitos or something, but that oligarch thing is only used about those regions. Like you'll hear like Russian oligarch, Nigerian oligarch, Mexican oligarch. No one ever says Ukrainian oligarch. No one ever says like Texan oligarch about some guy with a hog leg pistol at his waist whose ancestors chased off the Indians, who's in the oil wildcatting business. So yeah, I think that's just a heuristic. It means tough guy from a developing country. I don't really think the oligarchs are any more or less corrupt than our business people. I mean, if you gave me a hit of LSD and asked me, like, tell me what you really think, have the Clintons, for example, been responsible for some deaths over the years? I mean, that's an interesting question. The ruling class in most societies tends to be a little more predatory than the middle, if not the lower classes. So yeah, I don't really know if the frame is all that meaningful. I will say, like in Russia specifically, even more than Ukraine, there was a lot of gangsterism following the fall of the Soviet Union. So like Russia one year, I mean, the highest murder rates in the world are usually in Caucasian, Hispanic countries, followed by less long settled, let's say, African countries. And I remember one year Russia shot its way right up the list. It was like, but either 10 or 30. I mean, I know that's a big gap, but murders per 100,000 people per year. This went on for a couple of years, and I'm positive that was the period right after Soviet Union, USSR collapse. So, I mean, a lot of those guys who took over businesses probably did so by walking into the office, shooting the president, and forging their name on a series of documents that said, Vladimir Karashtakov III is, the new head of Rustapram. So, I mean, you saw a lot of companies change hands. And even now in Russia, you see some of that James Bond stuff that we haven't done in the West for 30, 40 years, since the Bond era, really. But like a political leader who opposes the intelligence services mysteriously falls out of a hotel window. But it's like in the Burj Al Arab. It's in another country. It's 1,000 feet up. How'd it happen? Real mysterious. I mean, there was that time Russian agents tracked a guy to Mexico and killed him. I mean, just like all this stuff, allegedly. So, I mean, I think that there is some utility to the term, but at the same time, if you wanted to describe Trump or Clinton using similar language, it would be the easiest thing in the world to do so. So mostly a heuristic, I guess, would be my point.
Yeah. And if you spent some
Charles
time
Gordon,
with somebody,
just
go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was also going to say, yeah, when you talk about Charles Gordon and slavery and all that, there's a whole bunch there. Again, this would be more. I mentioned some glorious Black history. Here's some glorious quote unquote white history. Now, none of us are responsible for the things these people we didn't personally know did. Keep that in mind. But I mean, Britain with the Mid-Atlantic blockade ended the slave trade. We helped in the USA, but I mean, at that point, the U.S. and French navies combined were like a third the size of the British Navy. So, like, Britain ended slavery. Like, they took half their fleet, maybe a little less. They exaggerated it a bit, but a huge portion of their fleet. And they would blockade around the world. They would sail to Brazil. They would sail to the slave ports on what we'd now call Lebanon. They would sail to the pirate islands. And they would just set up with cannons outside the slave market. And you could sell slaves. You just couldn't take them anywhere. And if you did, the British would sink your boat, rescue the slaves, and you would die.
Monsters.
Yeah, and this went on for decades. I mean, if you Google British Mid-Atlantic Patrol, now the Wikipedia and Britannica articles are written in this horrible liberal post-2012 fashion. So they include all these caveats like not every slave was freed, but the incredible amount of effort that was put out by the West to end slavery is something almost forgotten. So everyone historically has had slaves. What did these sort of, by this point, integrated, heavily armed Western countries, what did they bring to slavery that was unique? The ending of it. I mean, that's the only unique thing that Westerners did.
You know, I wanted to go back to the oligarch thing again, because I've been studying this stuff and looking into it. And, you know, you could look into these records. A lot of them are public, and you can say, oh, Dave bought this company for what appears to be a market price. You know, sometimes more money because they, you know, like, hey, I have to buy this thing at a higher price than market because I want it and I see a possibility in that. And it's really hard to make someone to be an oligarch, you know, like, oh, man, they paid 115% for this thing. But because they are like, I see the future. I'm going to pay you what it's worth and then some because I really want it to make a network of things. But we don't bother to do that shit, man. Like we don't, you see these reports on these guys and it's really, it's telling. And I don't know who drives this stuff, but anyhow. You know, it's just it's interesting. The more I dig in, the more I see people playing ponies, and with something to gain for different things, different outcomes coming out. So anyhow, anything in closing from you?
Not a whole lot, but I'll take it back to the start of the conversation and say always be wary, because a lot of people that listen to both of us are in leadership roles of like the top-down decision that looks good. Like if you are doing business overseas and someone comes up to you, and this could be anyone from your cab driver to a CEO of a small company, from my experience in the third world, that says, you know, I speak fluent English. I went to the University of Illinois. My brother lives in Scarsdale, and I have perfect knowledge of this market you're about to enter. You know, maybe do some bottom-up research first. You know, speak that language if you're going to do something there. Talk to people in that community. 9 times out of 10, you'll find out that person is basically lying. The simple top-down solution is almost never correct. And this actually ties back into the Thomas Sowell series that we sometimes do. Like there are 2 ways to look at knowledge. One is to look at knowledge. And I guess I did have something to say. One is to look at knowledge as kind of the preserve of a small group of professionals who we can call the experts or the boss men or something like this. So why do we know that? Why should we all stay inside under COVID, despite the fact we haven't stayed inside during epidemics of far more deadly microviral diseases? It doesn't make sense. Experts say, fool. You know, so that's one perspective. The other perspective is that knowledge is very broadly disseminated, so that any individual expert has twice the knowledge of me or you or a general expert, like most of our listeners. But there are 300, well, actually, there are a lot of idiots. There are 100 million general experts, and on any given topic, there may be 500 people you're supposed to be listening to. So very, very often, you'll see more knowledge rise up from the general experts, i.e. under COVID, a lot of people who have a college level training in statistics noticed that people weren't dying, that the death rate was, I mean, we lost 1 million total over 4 years. It's terrible, but the 4 million people die every year. People noticed that these genocidal predictions just weren't coming true, and they had college level statistical training, and they were able to break down the probability of that happening if the doomsday speakers were correct. And so they just went about their lives. And in that situation, and in many others, when you look at farming, when you look at common law, when you look at the basic idea that anyone can be a juryman or a journalist or publish in an interdisciplinary journal, that's very, very common, that the mass wisdom of the people over the centuries is more accurate than the current knowledge of the experts. So anyway, work for bottom up rather than top down solutions when you're making big business or military decisions. I guess that's my point.
I love it. I love it. And if you don't have capacity in a foreign language, be really good at work with interpreters, because those guys are awesome. That's how I made my money. By the way, you mentioned our series of books. Here is the next one: Affirmative Action Around the World. It's a Thomas Sowell book. We'll do that again real soon, probably in about 2 weeks if I can get through the rest of this book. So look for those, and look for all of those at on the YouTube channel. Just type in YouTube Pete A. Turner and they'll all come up. Anything else before I push this button to shut this show off?
Nope. Yeah, no, that's it.
Perfect.
I think we've gone through
Hey,
it.
thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you